extraordinary time, time that the world hasn't seen in about 100 years. There's no playbook or blueprint for us to really talk or think about how we handle this. And I'm going to do my best to share with you some thoughts about how those of you who are leading CSR in your companies, who care about CSR, are passionate about it, studying it, might think a little bit about it in this time, in this context, and how we might learn some of the lessons that we've taken from our Project ROI research series and apply it to this extraordinary situation. Now, Harsha, one thing that I wanted to ask you is that I've shared some slides with you, and I'm happy if you want to run them, and I'll tell you when to advance them, or let me know the best way that we should proceed in that regard.
Please feel free to run it from your side. You can share the screen so that you would have more control over them.
All right, then let me try and see if...
In line of maybe LOB or the mandated BI policy and also the cybersecurity risk, which has got a major...
And I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear that clearly.
Do you want me to share the screen from my side?
Based on what Zoom is telling me, I think we're going to have to, yes.
Okay, no problem. I'll do that.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. Well, why don't we go to the next slide? So I'm going to share with you a little bit about the work my firm does. We've done some research into looking at how the situation currently is in India and how companies are using CSR to respond. We'll talk a little bit about our Project ROI research and then see how we can adapt it to the amazing and often strange situation that we're in right now. If we can go to the next slide. A little bit more about our firm. We've been engaged for about 7 years. And in that time, we work around the world. We've had the great fortune of doing work in India. It's been, I would say, probably a little over 2 years since I was last in Delhi. And I miss it dearly and hope that I'm able to get back there very, very soon. And as Harsh was mentioning, our focus is to try and work with our clients to deliver superior financial performance by the way that they engage in their social and environmental performance. We see that delivering superior financial performance is important really for everyone, for a large company, a small, medium-sized company, or even for an NGO and a nonprofit, because every organization needs financial resources in order to support the mission that it's trying to conduct. So that's a little bit of the background on our mission. And if you go to the next slide. So I don't pretend to be an expert in what's going on currently in India right now, but we've been doing some research and looking at what's happening. And we understand that there are a number of trends. And so if we, I imagine that we'll have time for question and answers. If there's some things that I'm missing or if there are things that I've misconstrued, it would be very, very helpful to hear. But what we see based on the research that we've done, a number of things. First, we understand that the Companies Act has been, of 2013, has been interpreted to allow a broader set of contributions and engagement that will make the way that companies are getting involved to support and address COVID-19 eligible under the requirements of the CSR contributions that companies are supposed to make. In addition, what we're starting to see is some evidence that I think is a trend that is happening certainly in the United States and around the world, that even though there are dedicated CSR teams and professionals, that the executive leadership team is getting very, very engaged in trying to make decisions and understand where support and contributions should go related to COVID-19. And I think that this may be a mixed blessing in some situations, that certainly in many instances, our companies have been hoping to get the attention of executives, but at the same time, understanding that there may be a framework, a methodology, a dedicated professional set of guidelines, and a professional practice that has identified the best way to go about this. And sometimes executives come in with very little experience trying to put their imprint and their stamp on what should be happening. So there can be kind of a tension that we're finding. Third, that again, this is something that I would see around the world, that the way that CSR is working right now is very similar to what happens when we're responding to disasters. And that makes sense, because effectively, I think the best way to understand and grasp the way to respond to COVID is through the framework of disaster relief and response. While we're seeing that some in India have launched some very, very impressive, very impressive corporate partnerships, that at the same time, we're seeing that companies are also seeing that with the tension that's going on with regard to the economic situation, that CSR staffing and budgets may be under threat right now in India and elsewhere. And also we're seeing that NGOs are very much focused on saying that they need support to stay in operation. And while they're expecting things to go back to normal, there's some tension that they may be under threat in terms of the economic consequences of the coronavirus. So those are some of the things that we're seeing in the Indian landscape, and we'd be interested to hear more from you. So having said that, why don't we move to the next slide? What would I add in terms of additional trends going around the world? Well, I'll spare you a lot of the detail, but there's some things that I think may resonate with your context. And that is that there was an article that the Wall Street Journal just did looking globally and finding that companies are in tremendous tension in terms of saying that sustainability has never been more important, but at the same time, they're cutting back on programs. And when we talk about CSR, when we talk about the focus on community support, we're hearing again this same type of tension where CEOs are going to their team and saying one day, you've never been more important and more valuable to the firm. And then the next day saying, you have to demonstrate a business case, otherwise your budget is going to be under threat and we're going to have to cut your team back. And so we're seeing this multiple personality disorder and this tension happening because of the coronavirus. If we go to the next slide. All right, so then the question that I'd like to address with you is, how do we respond to this? That even though our function has never been more important, how do we show that we are truly valuable to the business and the bottom line? And where I'd like to start is by talking a little bit about research that we had initially applied for normal times, and to see a little bit about what that says about the value of our function, and then what we can learn about how it would hold up in the time of the coronavirus. So if you can go to the next slide. And you'll forgive me, one of the interesting things of the coronavirus is how it's changed our lives and how it's transformed us into virtual workers and using technology and the ability to connect with you amazingly by video conference over long distance. You can hear that our company mascot, or what I like to call our corporate cat, is in the background, who wants to join the presentation and may in fact do that. So I can't promise you, but I may have a guest presenter in our cat coming, and I will apologize in advance for the interruption. But as we see here, let me talk to you a little bit about this research that we've conducted. You can see just a sampling of the kinds of companies that range across the spectrum, from healthcare to manufacturing to consumer goods to financial services. And we've done 3 reports in our research series that you can access through our website, or you can send me an email and I'll be happy to share with you. And you can see the kind of reviews that we've had for this research that's focused on the business case for both ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as well as for community support and CSR. If you go to the next slide. To give you a little bit of background, we've had an interesting methodological process where we've engaged with senior executives and members of executive leadership teams, because they're our core audience for this research, and done an assessment of what they would look for, and what would persuade them about the business case for CSR. And one of the things they've said is to say, we don't need a new single study. We need to understand what the consensus of research tells us. And so we've done a type of meta-analysis that's looked at this point over 600 studies. The slide may be out of date somewhat. And done that analysis to begin to share the kinds of results that we provided to you. If there's more questions about our methodological approach, I'd be happy to address them in the Q&A. But for now, why don't we go to the next slide? Let me give you the headline finding, and that is that our Project ROI, ROI meaning return on investment, finds that CSR absolutely and beyond a shadow of a doubt drives the financial performance of our business, and that you do provide financial value from what you do, but only when CSR is done well. And I think that is a very, very important caveat, because one of the things that we've found in the research, and in my now, I will admit, 25 years in this field, is that a lot of the research on the business case tries to make the claim that almost everything that we do in CSR will drive business value. And honestly, that could not possibly be true. There's no other part of your business which drives value 100% of the time. Even your product development teams, your manufacturing teams, certainly your marketing and sales teams don't always succeed. And neither do we in CSR. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. So one of the things that we've done is tried to define what doing CSR well means. We'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to entice you a little bit with some of the findings of the value that CSR can provide. So if we go to the next slide. What we found is that CSR, when done well, has the potential to support and move forward key performance indicators, or KPIs, that matter the most to our executive team and to our investors. And so what we find is that CSR has the potential to increase our sales by as much as 20%, which is a gigantic number, and that this figure we see can apply both to B2C, business to consumer companies, as well as B2B companies. Now, not every company is guaranteed a 20% boost in sales from the CSR work that they do. There's going to be some kind of continuum depending on the kinds of strategies and the kinds of approaches you define, and also the way that you include CSR messaging in your marketing and your communication. So what you see here is a continuum. And what we find, and when we start to look at specific companies that we've worked with, sometimes the boost may be less than 1%, sometimes it may be 10%, sometimes it may be somewhere else on that continuum. And that we won't really know until we begin to look at the specific strategies of a company. But what we do know is that the research that we've seen show that companies have been able to achieve that 20% benchmark. In fact, there are those who've done research that show they've been able to exceed it. A good example, of course, is a company that's very familiar and very active in India, and that's Unilever, which has done its own research to identify that their sustainable living plan, and particularly their community support work, they credit with boosting their sales over a period from 2009 to 2012 by over 26%. And there's some fascinating ways they've been able to do that, which I'd be happy to talk about more in our Q&A. You can also see some other very important KPIs on the slide in terms of using CSR to boost your share price by as much as 6%, or reduce your employee turnover, particularly the employees that you would otherwise want to stay, by as much as half. You can see it boosting your market value based on reputation by as much as 11%, productivity by up to 13%, and actually reducing financial risk by as much as 4%, and risk of litigation. There's also other metrics that we have in terms of reducing financial risk, and a number of other HR-related metrics that we can talk about as well. But this gives you a flavor of the power for CSR to specifically drive results. These are very eye-opening and very, very exciting, I think, for the field, and very exciting for executive leadership teams as well as investors. If we can go to the next slide. We've also done some look for those companies here that are publicly traded. We've created a framework and a way to score companies based on our Project ROI methodology, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail, and found that companies that we see that sort of live the best practices that Project ROI defines are able to outperform their peers in the stock market, sometimes by extraordinary numbers. And that when we compare to one of the leading global benchmarks, the Standard & Poor's 500, which is a group of 500 of the most actively traded companies in the global stock market, we find that companies that adopt the Project ROI good practices outperform them over a 5-year period of 117%. And if I had known that 5 years ago, I would have changed my investment approach. And I would not be talking to you now. I would be talking to you from my compound in some beautiful beachside resort, maybe in Goa or some other place, in this semi, if not full retirement. But I've learned from my mistake, and now we'll start investing more based on the CSR performance that we're able to evaluate. If you go to the next slide. We can also see that there's evidence in our research that shows that CSR is driving a particular results related to consumer results and consumer behavior in terms of purchasing. What you may have seen, and this is something that I've seen across India as well as globally, is that there are a number of research studies which have shown that around 70 to 80% of consumers would prefer to buy from a company that does CSR well. And the one thing that our research has found is that those studies actually are not quite true, that we don't find that number of consumers who are actively making their purchasing decisions at that high a level. What we find is something I think is much more realistic, and that is that for every company, whether a business to consumer or business to business, we're going to find a range of about anywhere from 1 to 20% of your 1 to 20% of your customers whose preferences are going to be driven by what you do in communities and what you do in CSR. And those preferences are going to be very much aligned. They're going to be passionate about what you do. And once they discover what you do, if it aligns with their own values and with their own attitudes and expectations for you, it will be the main driver of how they make purchasing decisions. And not only that, they will become your brand ambassador, and they will tell other customers that they must purchase from you because you are such a good and responsible company. Then there's going to be another segment of your customer base, which will be anywhere from, let's say, 1 to around 30 or 40% of your customer base, who will not purchase because of CSR as their main driver. But if they see an alignment, and if they see that your values are helping them to understand their own values, then they will make purchasing decisions. They will be strongly influenced by what you do in your CSR. And so we actually were asked by one of our clients to do a research, a survey of over 3,000 individuals in the insurance industry, which was a very, very hard and challenging test for us to see if this was actually true for them as well. And you can see that the numbers line up very, very strongly, that about 27% of their potential market is highly passionate about what the industry is doing in CSR, and their purchasing decisions would be driven by what they see. Another 21% have high expectations, and it is a substantial driver for what they're doing. We also found that the kinds of customers that were most passionate for CSR are the most lucrative, the ones who buy the most insurance, the ones who have the highest levels of income, the highest levels of education, and all the highest level of urban living. The exact customers that any company in the insurance sector would love to have. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that we've been able to do and that Project ROI allows us to do is something that the field has lacked. And that is that one thing that a CSR function has not been able to do is something that a business line function can do. And that is that in the strategic planning process, to be able to do a financial projection and to tell the executive leadership team, the chief financial officer, that if you adopt a more integrated and aligned strategy for CSR and commit greater resources to what we're trying to do in a strategic way, that we will be able to point to a specific financial return that we will achieve based on our strategy over a period of time, say 2 to 3, 4, or 5 years. And what we've been able to do with the companies that we work with, and these are some examples on the page, I've had to hide their names because of non-disclosure agreements, but you can get an idea of how we've been able to do financial projections for them. And to be able to see that different kinds of industries and different kinds of companies are able to deliver these results. And so what this slide is not saying is that if you're in manufacturing that you will be guaranteed, for example, a 31% return on investment from what you do. That's not what this slide is saying. What this slide is saying is that the specific manufacturing company that we looked at, we evaluated their strategy. We saw what kind of business they were in. We benchmarked their competitors, and for what they're doing, we see that they have the potential over the next 3 years to deliver that 31% return. So it's very much a customized analysis that you're seeing right here. This is something that your companies can now do because of the Project ROI methodology, and something that I think is very, very exciting because you can communicate more clearly with your chief financial officer and with your CEO about the potential that you have. If we go to the next slide. We've also been able to apply the Project ROI methodology to help companies do better measurement in terms of their potential for community and social impact as well. And show, again, these are customized analysis that we're able to identify how we're able to use the methodology to show more clearly how many individuals will benefit, what kind of communities will benefit, and the numbers that will benefit as well. If we go to the next slide. So I've been teasing you about saying that these are the kinds of results, but we get these results only if we do CSR well. Well, what does doing it well mean? And our framework summarizes into a 4-step process that we call fit, commit, manage, and connect. And so the companies that do CSR well, that are able to use CSR to drive both business and financial value, as well as lead to social impact, follow this framework. The first element we call fit. Fit is about aligning what you do to the business. And this, I think, is often the most misunderstood best practice element, because many companies have gone through an exercise to try and align what they do to their business at a very, very high level. But what we see is that the companies that do this the best really take a deep dive into assessing what they do. Let me give an example. Many, for example, engineering and high technology companies will develop a CSR strategy that says, yeah, we create fit with what we do. We try and align our CSR approach with STEM education, with science, technology, engineering, and math. And so that is the way that we're fitting what we're doing. Well, we find that when we're really taking the concept of fit seriously, but that's the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. That what we find, for example, is that a company might be focusing on providing STEM education to 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. And that's certainly very valuable and very important. And I don't want to discourage companies from doing that. But if we're thinking, for example, of using that in order to support our human resources and workforce development strategies and our recruitment strategies, that we can imagine that if we're supporting the STEM education of a 5, 6, 7, or 8-year-old, that it's going to take anywhere from 10 to 20 years for that child to then grow up to someone who would be a candidate to come work for our company. And that is a little bit too much long-term thinking. So while we don't want to discourage those kinds of investments, at the same time, what we talk and work with our companies to see is how do we develop a portfolio that would use STEM education to support both that age group as well as an older age group, 18 to or 16 to 24-year-olds, who are going to be closer candidates to the kinds of eventual employees we want to have. That I think is a sort of an obvious example of how the concept of fit needs to work and needs to adapt to our business circumstances. The second level is what we call commit. And commit means that we actually start to focus 80% of our resources on those strategic areas of fit that we've identified. And this is something that's enormously difficult for many businesses, that many times we look at companies who have developed a CSR strategy, and what we find is that really less than 50% of their budget and other resources are actually going into the focus areas of that strategy, and that much more than 50% of resources are going into an amalgam of programs that are really spread all over the place and are very reactive and responsive. And so the companies that do this well are really concentrating their efforts on their strategic priorities that really fit with the business. The third area is manage, and this is that companies take the discipline of CSR very seriously and develop very serious metrics and measure the results and impact that they have, as well as integrating what they do, not just in the CSR team, but with their business lines as well. And then last but not least is to connect, and that involves a couple of things. Number one is actually communicating very actively what it is that you do. Companies are still very, very shy about promoting their CSR work. We don't want to brag about what we're doing, but we do want to make people and our stakeholders aware. And the other thing is that we want to collaborate with our stakeholders so that our stakeholders are actually working with us to identify the priority areas and strategies that we're developing. And when we're talking about our stakeholders, we're talking about our communities, certainly, but also engaging the viewpoints of our investors, our customers, and our employees. And companies that do all of these things exhibit leading practice and will show the potential to deliver the kinds of financial KPIs that we were talking about a moment ago. Now, if we can go to the next slide. So in this context, if this is the results, if these are the results of Project ROI, how do we begin to think about them and apply them in the incredible and extraordinary times that we're focusing on right now with the coronavirus? And so if we can go to the next slide. And I think what I'm going to try and do is I'm noticing the questions are coming in, but I tell you what, I'll probably try and go back and respond to them after I just go through these next few slides. So thank you for your patience. If I look at the next slide, in these extraordinary times, we're beginning to see very, very rapidly over the last 2 months, a set of criteria that are beginning to define what responsible business practice begins to look like in the time of the coronavirus. And on the left side of the screen, this is our assessment and synthesis from a variety of different sources that collectively create Impact ROI's checklist. And this is a summarized version. It's actually a little bit longer than what you're seeing on this page. A summarized version of what different stakeholders, from investors to the general population, are beginning to expect from business in terms of how they will respond. And first and foremost, it starts with your employee security and how you are actually treating employees to make sure that they are safe, but also to try and as much as possible to protect their jobs and their income. Then very close following that is the way that your companies support your customers to, again, make sure that they're safe, but also the economic factors are very important to make sure that this is not a moment in which you're starting to raise prices significantly, and particularly for vital and essential services, and particularly thinking about those who may be negatively affected, may be losing their jobs, losing their income in this time. The other, if we move to the right a little bit, supply chain security, because we're seeing right now, particularly in the United States, but also seeing in Europe and elsewhere in the world, that supply chains are becoming extraordinarily vulnerable. We're seeing stories of terrible situations in which, for example, farmers are actually having to throw away very, very good produce because they cannot bring them to market and cannot begin to distribute them. We're having huge logistical challenges. And I know that this is a challenge within India, but India as a major part of the global supply chain for the West and Europe and the United States, and also for China and elsewhere. This is a challenge in terms of your logistics as well. And then last but not least, we have the category of the expectations for your general environmental, social, and governance performance, which we find, and I'll talk about in more detail in a moment, are certainly things that we can't put on the back burner. Our continued commitment to this is very, very important. And what's particularly important is that we emphasize our material issues. So while your companies may be doing a whole range of activities in the time of the coronavirus, you can't do everything. So focusing on those issues which are most material and most important are important to your stakeholders. So that's the full picture of the expectations for corporate responsibility. But what about for community, which I skipped over? That's on the right side of the slide. And the checklist here is something that I mentioned earlier, and that is that we're in a moment in which we need to activate the type of approach that we would typically use if we were responding to a natural disaster, if there's a flood or if there's a typhoon or some kind of event coming from nature or a man-made disaster that we would normally activate our resources to respond. And we can look certainly at the coronavirus as a disaster. I think it qualifies. And what that means is that we go through phases. The first phase in any disaster response is immediate relief. And when we're thinking about getting humanitarian aid, general support to NGOs that are going to be very, very important to the response, just to make sure not to think about any kind of strategic program or focused program, but just to make sure that in this time they're able to do their work and able to deliver their vital services and to just stay in business and to coordinate with government and the government response. What we're starting to see right now as the experience of being on lockdown and quarantine matures, and as we start to think about the tentative steps to opening up different parts of the economy, we need to start thinking about recovery. And that is providing social services for those who are going to be affected out of work, out of jobs, who have experienced health crises. Rebuilding infrastructure. In this case, that might be literal infrastructure as well as virtual infrastructure. So that, for example, we're able to provide better education services online, health services online, for example, and building that kind of infrastructure. And that we're enhancing the capacity of nonprofits and NGOs to be able to continue to provide their services. The next phase, which most countries are not yet ready for, but will come very quickly, is building resilience. And building resilience is allowing us to move from the recovery phase to strengthening our communities so that they get back on their feet. And also using this so that we start thinking about how we prepare. One of the implications that our firm believes the coronavirus says and tells us is that, unfortunately, we are going to be entering into what you may have read and what business thinkers and thought leaders have called black swan events. Black swan is a very, very uncommon event that normally we would think of occurring once in a generation or even once in 100 years, that absolutely transform our way of living, often negatively, sometimes positively, and that transform business, sometimes ruining whole businesses and markets and industries, sometimes creating whole new ones. And I think what we are going to see is that we've seen this happen on the on the natural disaster scale, that across the world, we see the concept of the 500-year flood, the type of flood that ruins communities and happens only once every 500 years, now starting to happen with incredible frequency, once every 10 years or once every 2 years. And I think that what we're going to see right now is that the black swan event, unfortunately, that COVID represents, is going to happen in a much faster pace, so that we may find that with the climate crisis, there are other types of pandemics that we begin to see in a much more frequent way. But we'll also see other types of crises. They may be disasters, they may be economic shocks, they may be political shocks, they may be things that we can't quite imagine right now that are going to be happening with much greater frequency and that will affect whole countries, whole regions, and even the globe. So we have to start thinking about a resilience mindset of how we start preparing communities, not just to respond to natural disasters, but global pandemics, economic shocks, and political shocks of all kinds. And moving that into this resilience phase is where our strategic approach to CSR comes back. Of course, many of your companies, because India is a leader, many of your companies also have existing strategic investment programs. And we don't want to ignore those because the communities still need the kinds of approach and focus that you've been driving forward. And applying our core resources in terms everything from skilled volunteers to strategic investments to our manufacturing, our products and services used for social purpose, and social related research and development has never been more important in the time of the coronavirus. And so this is the checklist for companies who want to be seen as responsible to their communities need to think about right now. If that makes sense, then I'll move to the next slide. So if companies start to adopt these approaches, does this support your bottom line? Do the Project ROI findings that I shared before still hold? And what we're seeing is that it's a little bit early to tell this definitively, but there's evidence that suggests absolutely yes, this is the case. And so there's some initial research that has been done by Bank of America's Global Research Unit. It's the Bank of America, but it's a global company working in hundreds of countries around the world. Harvard University, and then a very, very interesting group called Just Capital have begun to do some initial research that say, are companies who are adopting the responsible practice checklist from the previous slide, are they outperforming their peers in the stock market? And the answer initially says yes. We'll have to continue to watch this. On the right side of the slide, we start to see that a number of firms, BlackRock, which is the world's biggest private equity investor, with $6 trillion US under assets, MSCI, the Morgan Stanley company that does ESG analysis and rating, and Morningstar, a very, very large investment analyst, are all finding that the trend is that more capital is flowing into ESG investing funds, number one. Those funds seem to be outperforming traditional investment funds. And then third, what's so fascinating is that the coronavirus, one of the fascinating implications that it's done is that while companies are in a state of tension about thinking about cutting back their ESG and community investments, or trying to sort of respond to the coronavirus by cutting back other investments, ESG investors, their attitude is that they're beginning to adopt ESG metrics and frameworks into their mainstream investment models. And that where they may have been skeptical before, the coronavirus is making them believers in ESG frameworks now and going forward. So that's fascinating research with strong implications for all of us during this time. If we go to the next slide, how do we begin to think about how companies then would adopt the Project ROI best practices in this time of COVID-19? How would that look? And how would we see that the practices that you would adopt now would potentially create value for your business, which is extremely important because many businesses are threatened by the economic consequences of this crisis, and also how would it show that they're very impactful? Well, we've done some research in a number of Indian companies, and this is all secondary research that we've looked at. We haven't had the opportunity to dive in directly with companies and analyze them and help modify and adapt their strategies, which we're doing with a number of other companies right now, working around the globe. But based on what we can see from secondary research, the Mahindra Group is very, very impressive to us in terms of the things that it's done. Number one, it's committed to the World Economic Forum's set of stakeholder principles that have been modified to account for the coronavirus, and showing that they're going to work with stakeholders in ways to combat the coronavirus and work towards a global recovery. The way that it's begun to partner with government and mobilized its own capabilities, its own information technology department to help monitor the progress of the disease across cities, to begin to start using its capability to manufacture ventilators and low-cost respirators, particularly for the underserved, at-risk, and lower-income populations. And also to begin to use its foundation to help those that are most vulnerable recover. These are the kinds of approaches that we see both responding to the COVID-19 checklist that I just shared, as well as the best practice framework of fit, commit, manage, and connect. If we go to the next slide, another example that we're impressed by is Emphasis, and that they're, again, donating quite a bit of money to provide protective gear and equipment that's necessary for health workers, and that they're beginning to use their facilities to provide hospital-related services while also focusing on those who are most vulnerable. If we go to the next slide. Wipro has received global headlines for its work in terms of modifying one of its office facilities, industrial parks, so that it can be a hospital that will provide 450 beds, as well as for the strategic approach it's adapted from its foundation, again, in terms of supporting those most in need. So these are all very, very impressive examples during this time to us, and examples that position the companies to actually use CSR for great impact, but also to support the business. As we go to the next slide. So one of the things that we do in work with our companies is to be able to do an analysis and diagnostic process, which will be able to assess the approach the companies are taking to CSR, how well it's aligned with the business, how well it's set to actually make tangible impact for communities and for society, and to be able to provide a score that both companies and investors can use to understand how CSR is able to strategically drive impact and results. And so I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, and happy to follow up with Harsha and IICSR on any of your interest in that. If we go to the next slide. I'd just like to share with you my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me for information, some of the analysis and citations and research studies that we have. Any interest in terms of using our processes for things that we've had, Harsha and I would be happy to follow up with you. And I would just thank you for joining us in this extraordinary time, and also for the great work that the Institute, the Indian Institute for CSR, is doing, which is incredibly impressive. with this, I don't know if we want to open up the lines, but I know that there are many chats and that you've been very patient in terms of providing questions and comments. And I will do my best to try and respond in the time that we have left. And so,
one of the questions that I have for you is, although Project ROI is primarily for the businesses, do you think that the many government schemes and many charity foundations, they are also investing in social welfare activities? How do they measure their ROI?
How do governments and NGOs who are involved in this measure their ROI is the question?
Yeah.
That's a great question. And so for the most part, the social impact, there's two types of measurement that we often talk about with CSR. We talk about measuring the business case and we talk about measuring social impact. And many people commonly think that measuring the business case is harder to do. I disagree. I think the hardest part of measurement is the social impact. And that's true for business and your CSR programs, and that's true for government and for NGOs as well. I think that there are many, many methodologies that government and social organizations can use to measure. That would be at least a whole other session, if not an entire training day. And it's something that I know that IICSR does, as well as Project ROI does this work. I'll just say a few things that we like to look at. And that is that what we advise for organizations, both business as well as government and nonprofits and NGOs, is that we think about trying to attack the difficult challenge of social impact measurement through what we call a portfolio process. And that is that there are going to be some programs that lend themselves very, very well to trying to do an academic approach in which we're able to do the equivalent of creating randomized control groups and comparison groups that show us how our intervention was able to create results compared to the status quo. And there are other academic approaches that can use statistical regression analysis to do very similar things. But that can only be applied in our experience to a few types of programs that have been set up to lend themselves for the kind of data collection and the kind of investment that's required to do that. So where we have those types of programs, we can go and identify them and apply those kinds of measurement processes. Then there's a second level of measurement, which is more practical, in which we can begin to say, we may not be able to do a thorough academic process like this, but what we can do is try and engage very, very informed people and involve the community in terms of asking them questions that would almost do the job of what a comparative study would do for us. And to begin to say, based on your expert opinion or experience, how has your life improved? How have conditions improved because of our interventions compared to others? So there are other methodologies that we can use that aren't as rigorous, but are practical and get at almost the same results. And then there's a lower level that is the lowest cost form of intervention, which is just to use reasonable people who can be used to identify in a robust way to identify what the likely impact of our programs are, and identifying those non-biased views who are able to track what the results are, and to be able to set some practical metrics where reasonable people would say, if our intervention was having an impact, we would expect to see the following kinds of results happen, and setting up what those metrics are. And companies that are able to create that kind of portfolio of measurement are able to engage evaluation processes in a way that's more affordable, more practical, gets results faster, and able to be very usable so that they can take that information and improve their programs in real time. So it's a very, very challenging process, and I hope my answer has been able to be somewhat helpful.
Sure. Well, people can actually switch on their mic and ask the question.
Hi, may I ask a question? My
Sure,
name is
please.
Ajit Dayal from Quantum Advisors in India. I'm very curious to see about the slide that you had where you showed BlackRock and a couple of other people. And, you know, groups like BlackRock have been accused of greenwashing and green wishing, where they claim to support ESG, where they write fantastic annual reports, but they're actually supporting some of the most disgusting and scoundrel companies in the world, including in India. Right now, they're shareholders in Larsen and Toubro, which is building a coastal road that has the potential to flood the city of Bombay. So how do you sort of take care of that, you know, in this sort of general space of figuring out who's a genuine do-gooder and who's doing good out there or supposedly doing good when actually they're not, and they're just trying to claim the headlines and the headline space?
Thank you so much for your question. It's a challenge. And I would say that right now, the financial services and investment community is going through a maturation process right now. So if we're talking about leaders like BlackRock and leading mainstream companies, I think that what we find in their own practices is that they started by creating their own CSR teams that don't necessarily align with their business. What's happened over the last 5 years is that we're starting to see transformation in these companies where the influence of the type of work they do with CSR and ESG is starting to make their way into the investment portfolio and decision making. And the first way that that's starting to influence their thinking and decision making is related to the climate crisis. And what we're starting to see right now is that companies are starting to create what I would call positively screened funds, in which they're starting to give privilege to companies that are thinking about creating low carbon approaches to investment. They are not yet quite at the point in which they're creating negatively screened funds, in which they would look at a fossil fuel company or others that are emitting too much carbon and removing them from their portfolios. But what we were starting to see, even in the last 6 to 12 months, is a number of leading investment firms around the world beginning to take that concept very, very seriously and beginning to create new kinds of funds and investment programs which would start to do that, sparking an interesting trend that may not be moving fast enough, but is starting to move. What we're starting to see and what the coronavirus is doing right now is that the one area that was lagging in terms of this kind of thinking was how these kinds of big investment firms were thinking about social metrics. And I think that if there are positives to come out of the coronavirus, one of the interesting ones is that it's actually begun to open eyes in these big investment firms that they need to take not just the climate crisis seriously, but social metrics seriously as well. And so when you talk about BlackRock, there is criticism that is very worthy for them, as well as for all of the large financial service institutions, quite frankly. It's very hard for a financial service institution to score very well on our Project ROI framework, for example, because of these inconsistencies. But what we're starting to see, interestingly, is that COVID may be a spark that pushes them forward so that they actually, the rhetoric that they're sharing starts to enter into the reality. So it's something that I think we should all watch. And thanks so much for your question.
Hello.
Are there other questions?
I'm Dr.
Oh, go ahead.
Cleopatra. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Steve, excellent presentation. And the framework is very useful. But as you know, in India, we measure CSR in terms of spending, in rupee terms. And it has to be done in project mode. Now with this new situation, where a lot of money has been allocated to the government funds and money is going to reduce to NGOs and all, do we need to relook, revisit, and realign our projects? How do we do that in a ROI framework? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the Companies Act of 2013, if I'm understanding this correctly, has been something that has been an inspiration to countries around the world. In practical terms, of course, we know that the actual implementation of it and that the challenge of any mass government regulation can be that one size does not always fit all, and sometimes it can make us feel as if we're directing our approaches in some things that aren't as impactful as they might be. But what I would say is this, that my understanding, and forgive me, I'm not an expert, is that there is some great opportunity to think about the projects that we support in India, and that the projects and that the NGOs that are supported, there are ways to think about them from a set and a framework that is not necessarily reactive and responsive. I think that there is some opportunity in terms of the companies that I've spoken to, and speaking certainly with Harsha and the team at the Institute, as well as others, that have led executives to be, I think, in many companies, to be a little bit too reactive, and to think about responding to the Companies Act by just trying to count the money that's going out the door. And I think that your question is that thinking about certainly the amount that we're investing, but how we're investing it, and working in partnership with the NGOs and nonprofits and charities that are in India to say that we will make these contributions, but we want to make them under a strategic framework so that we can see actual results and progress on issues that are very, very important to our business as well as our stakeholders, and do so in a way that allows us to demonstrate what kind of good corporate citizen we are, and in a way that allows us to follow this kind of strategic framework that helps our business and helps society as well. And there are approaches that can be used that can be a win for all sides. And so it still allows companies to support projects and get the appropriate amount of budget out the door to be in compliance with the Companies Act, while at the same time using the framework and being very supportive. And in the examples that I've shared, we can see how that approach can work during the coronavirus, and see how it can work beyond. Thank you so much for your question. I don't know how much time we have for additional.
We are running short of time, though we have two questions over here. One is from Mr. Anjan. Is there some convergence between business case, social impact, measurement, and the way?
Harsha, I'm there.
Please.
Explain the question. Hi.
Yes, please.
Hi, Steve. Excellent presentation. Quick question. So there is a methodology for measuring ROI from a business perspective. There are methodology for measuring social impact, the SROI, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, when governments allocate the funds for social sector schemes, I guess may not be a methodology, for there is some madness to the method. So do you see a potential way forward, convergence at some point of time? And if yes, are there case studies of that having been done that you are aware of? Thanks.
Forgive me, I'm muted. A convergence in measuring the social impact?
Yeah, measuring social impact, measuring business impact, and measuring the way governments assess the benefit of their expenditure programs on the society and community. So do you see a potential of these three methodologies, three different prisms, if you like, converging at any point of time?
I think it's a fascinating question. I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and I think that actually the coronavirus allows us to do this. I think the leaders right now in terms of social impact measurement are coming actually from private foundations and grant makers around the world who are taking this enormously seriously and moving this forward. I think that the government approach to this has been very mixed, and that we'll find within a government agency, you'll find actually some offices and departments which are very, very good. and their colleagues right next to them are still using techniques that are very outdated and not very sophisticated. I think that business has been slow to take measurement and evaluation seriously. So there are just around the world, there are just a small group of companies that I think are leading on this. What's fascinating as well, I participated in a global meeting that was held in New York in December that was hosted by Salesforce as well as the Global Reporting Initiative that looked at the state of social impact measurement and how we need to drive this forward with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I also think that the work of the United Nations and the SDGs are driving forward a hope for convergence on the SDGs. There are a number of initiatives which are trying to do this. The conclusion of the meeting, unfortunately, was that it's going to be incredibly difficult to do. However, there are groups which are trying to come together to do this, and there are a number of global of efforts right now that I can try and follow up with you on. So again, thank you for the question.
Appreciate it.
And Arsha, I think that some of you are chiming in and asking the questions that you wrote in the chat, so I appreciate that. And Harsha, any final question?
I wanted to learn more on the ESG methodology, since ESG framework is not standardized and every company develops their own and every industry develops its own methodology. So what is a point where you could reach a standardization for the whole, which is acceptable by all the investment firms?
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. That's so challenging and so frustrating right now to business because there is no commonly accepted ESG framework. And what's so interesting is that I've been participating in a number of conversations and working with a number of large investment firms who have begun to investigate, without any offense to the existing systems, certain of the ones that we know very, very well. GRI, SASB, the Social Accounting Standards Board, the International Integrated Reporting Commission. And what they're finding is that those systems have not quite been framed or identified in a way that investors can use effectively. And that would then tell companies how they should design their programs to meet investor expectations. And that's not a surprise, because in these multi-stakeholder systems which have been designed, we have to be honest about why they've been designed. They've been designed because there's a sense that government around the world has not done its job in terms of identifying the roles that business need to play in addressing environmental and social issues and in the way they govern themselves. So what we see in these kinds of systems is sort of a regulation by a different name. And that design is very useful and effective, but not necessarily designed to show how a company should think strategically and think about a way it should communicate with its investors. And so what we're seeing right now is this debate and transformation where we see an initiative with the World Economic Forum trying to bring together the big four, PwC and Accenture and Deloitte and EY and others, to try and come up with a set of 24 metrics. We see a number of initiatives trying to do this. No one's been successful yet, and I think it's going to take at least another 3 to 5 years for us to get there. What I can say, though, and why we're excited about Project ROI is that Project ROI is a framework that allows us to use any of those systems, whether it's a World Economic one that's developing or GRI or SASB, and to be able to say, how can we take those guidelines and then relate them and direct them in a way that makes sense for our business strategy, and for our investor relations. And so that's something that we're suggesting be used right now in order to create a more common framework and approach. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. So any other questions anybody has? All right, Steve, it was great having you discussing and interacting with all of us, and we'd like to thank you for your time and cooperation, and I hope that the session was good. I wish you stay home, stay safe. Looking forward for more future interactions.
I greatly look forward to that. Thank you so much. And please, everyone, be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for being around. Thank you.
Thank you.